Alrighty, guys, I think we're going to begin. In today's lesson, what I want to be going through is I want to take you guys through Trenx X, and I want to go over some of the calls that I made last week. Since it's Monday today, and every Monday is the start of the new weekly pivot, I'm going to be adding all the weekly pivots I feel are going to be great pivots to trade for the week into the group. I'll show you here. Before I start, can you guys hear me okay? I just want to know that you can hear me okay. If you can just pop it in the chat or just give me a little signal. Just want to know that my sound is coming through clear for everyone. Okay, great. Thanks. Awesome. Okay, perfect. Every single Monday, we have the start of the new week and we have the new pivots. And in the group, if you guys go down into the trading ideas, I'm sure you've seen it there. I add all the pivots in here that I feel are going to be good pivots. And I'm mainly just adding very narrow weekly pivots. And last week, what I want to do in today's training is I just want to cover the ones I added last week. And then I want to go through some of the new ones that I've added today. So let's look over here. The ones I added last week were REQ, CKB, CVX, XTN, DUSK, Teacher, SI, DYDX, COTI, ENS, and TAU. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all of these right now and just kind of exploring the movements that they made in the week and also kind of seeing what would have been the best way to enter those trades. So here we are on the chart. I've got a nice little folder I made here, which has got last week's. So we're just going to go through all of these. And then these are all the new ones that I've added for this week, minus these ones. These are all the new ones I've added for this week. So then we'll just open those up. I'll show you guys how I found those and possibly what to look for this week and how to get the best out of these pivots. So the first one I added last week was TAU. And when I added it, it was roundabout over here. So it hadn't made any kind of movement yet or anything like that. Most of these hadn't. You know, guys, I don't know what country you're in, but pay attention to what time the market opens in your country. It's usually the start of the pivot. And you can see over here, the start of the pivot in my country happens at 2 a.m. Okay, it's a little bit earlier. It's 2 a.m. there. So it's a little bit late for me to wake up. Sometimes I do, but it's very difficult for me to get up that late. But if in your country the market opens at a good time, it's really great to be awake when it opens, because as the market opens, you have the upper hand, you have the edge, because you can see what the pivot's going to look like. You know, as the market opens, you can see if it's going to be a narrow pivot, so you know exactly what's going to happen to that pivot that week. So like, for instance, look at that pivot, look at this pivot, very, very narrow. Okay, I'm just going to turn off the monthly for now, and I'll turn it back on in a second. So look here. On TAU, we can see we've got three pivots here. Each one is higher than the next. Can you see this one's higher than that one? This one's higher than that one. This is what we call ascending pivots. It just shows us that the one is increasing, the other is increasing, and showing us that there is an uptrend actually happening. And you can see all of these pivots look relatively narrow. That's a narrow pivot, that's a narrow pivot, that's a narrow pivot. I mean, they're not super, super narrow, but they're narrow enough to get fantastic trades off of them. So last week, Monday, when I told you guys to pay attention to TAU, this is basically where it was, just on top of the pivot. What you guys want to do, this is what I do. I look for where does price open up that week in relation to the pivot. And you can see when price opened this week, it opened above the pivot, which is showing us it's a very strong bullish sign. If it opens underneath the pivot, it can show a bearish sign. And look, this week again, it's opening above the pivot. Even though this should still be a great one to look for this week. I didn't put it on the list, but it could be great because we've got these ascending pivots, which is letting us know there's a big movement happening. It's uptrend. You know, the uptrend, the momentum is carrying this upward. So now I'm going to add in the other features just to have a look. So there you go. This would have been the optimal places to enter on a weekly is to enter on the grid. On the grid or slightly off the grid. So like there are a few different places you could have entered. Price would have opened over here. You could have actually entered as price opened. That would have been one area because remember guys, if we're entering on a weekly grid, we're going to have our stop loss under the grid and not directly under, just a little bit of space because this is a bit more of a bigger trade, can be a little bit of a mini swing trade. And then our second entry would have been when price got into the grid and then broke just above the grid. And then you can see price came back to the grid, broke just above the grid. So we had three different places we could have actually entered as it opened because it was still relatively close to this grid. So the closer we can enter to the grid, the better. And these grids act as launch pads, like they really do. You'll notice here, price broke out of the grid and it shot up, came back to the grid, and then it shot up. These are very high probability zones where price is going to launch off of. And you'll notice that if you backtest your charts, you'll see this happens over and over again. So that would have been first area, second area, third entry. You had three different places to enter the trade. If this was a mini swing, the entry didn't need to be too precise, but if you can get close to the grid, that would have been fantastic. Then our first profit area would have been these blue lines. These blue lines represent a resistance. So the one line represents a resistance zone, and the second one represents a previous week high. So you can see this one over here represents the previous week high. If we just draw this along, you can see that there. That was the highest point that was reached in the previous week. And that's how these lines are created. And then this blue line represents a resistance line. If price is able to break both of these lines, that would have been our next entry. So guys, the reason these two lines are on the chart is because they're showing you where there's a very strong resistance on the chart. And two things can actually happen. Price can get to this point and it can reject it because it's a strong resistance area. But if price breaks through it, then it's usually going to go higher. This is usually how it happens. And you'll notice on your charts. So when price gets to these areas, we can use the TDI-X to look for divergences, but you've got to be careful as well because you have to use the TDI-X in confluence with the context. In this situation, we had a very strong uptrend. So going for a short can be more risky, especially if the market is very bullish. So in some ways, you want to have a one-sided bias. If price is above the weekly pivots, I'm only looking to long and I'm sticking to longs. It just keeps you safe because if you try short it and there's a lot of upward momentum, there's a higher probability of getting liquidated, or the trade going against you because we always want to trade in alignment where the market is moving. So you can see, guys, this tower trade from last week that I gave, it went up about 31% from the grid. 31%. I mean, if you'd just taken this one trade over the week, it would have been more than enough. We don't need to overtrade. We can just be very precise with our trades. And, I can recommend not trading too much as well. A lot of guys I know that can overtrade, and it's not necessary to trade too much unless you're super addicted to it. But you can see we got 30% from this trade. So now the new grid is starting over here. And we can see this could be a nice place to even start looking for an entry on Tau. So that was Tau from last week. See, if we had to add in the daily grids, I just want to show you this, guys, quickly, because this can really help with more precision, getting more precise entries. So you can see here, if we missed these entries over here, our next places we would have looked for entries is when price got on top of the grid. See, so that would have been a place, or that would have been an entry over there. So if we miss these entries, then we're going to focus on taking a daily entry. the daily grids are just going to help give us more precision into these, because basically how it works is this. I'll turn on the monthly quickly, and you can see over here, we're also above the monthly. So in this instance, we're above a monthly grid, a weekly grid, and then as soon as we get above a daily grid, we are confirmed that it is a very strong bullish. Because how it works is this. The monthly grid is basically your long-term trend. That what lets us know what's happening to the long-term trend. Then we've got the weekly. The weekly is basically letting us know what is happening to the mid-term trend. And then we've got the blue, which is the daily pivots, which is letting us know what's happening on the short-term trend. So we've got the long-term, the medium-term, and the short-term. You can trade just on the daily pivots, but it's very short-term. You just want to get in and out, and it's usually dependent on what's happening in the mid-term. But if the long-term, the mid-term, and the short-term all align, that is giving us higher risk, a low risk trade with a high probability of success. So in this instance, another way would be when price gets on all three of these pivots, you can see over here, gets above the monthly, the weekly, and the daily pivots. And that would have been an excellent entry right over here. Just as it broke here, you could have entered, or as it broke over here, you could have entered. Those would have been your two entry places. And there are other ways you can enter as well. I know like a lot of people do price action as well. You can enter on the break. You can see, look, there's a trend line. It breaks the trend, retests, and then carries on up. So you can see a lot of confluences are lining up in this instance. So those would have been the trades, how you would have entered into Tau. And then what I gave ENS. And ENS initially, let's see here, I'm just going to turn off the daily for now. The reason I picked ENS was because of the same situation. You can see we've got a monthly grid, and then we've got a weekly grid. And then look how tight this grid is compared to this grid. So first of all, this one is higher. So we've got an ascending grid. This one is higher than the one before it. And then we've got, this one is more narrow than this one, which is showing us when you get very narrow grids like this, this is also a very strong confluence that there's going to be a big movement that will happen. And then you can see over here, if I turn on the previous week, something important to notice, guys, is that you want to pay attention to the distance between the pivots and the resistance point, the blue lines. If it's a very high distance, price won't always make it to the top. It will, if it's a high distance, it means price has to work very hard, is to travel a lot to get all the way up here. So it will usually come about the 50% mark or the 70% mark. As you can see this week, guys, look at ENS. This is an amazing entry we're looking at for now. If you guys are looking for a trade, our ENS is a great trade to get into right now because we've got insane confluences. We've got above the monthly, above the weekly, and look, we've got this weekly is higher than this one, and this one's higher than that. So we've got three weeklies that are ascending. Plus, if you look at this grid, look how low the space is. So it doesn't have to travel very far to get from here to here, as opposed to the previous grid. So it already, if you look what price has already done today, it already shot up to the resistance point. Remember I said this resistance price can usually reject it. Coming back down, retesting. Now it might be going back up to actually see if it'll break this level. If it breaks it, it's got a high probability of going to these gray areas. So we could look at like a 10% move, 5, 10, 17%, if it ends up doing that. But this looks fantastic. It's a narrow grid. We've got a tight, a tight pivot, and it's on an uptrend. It's above the weekly, the monthly. But the signal I gave last week was basically over here. I think when I gave it, it was, your price was in this region. So the first place you could have entered is always as price is close to the pivot. You could have entered as I gave the signal around about here. You don't want it to get too high though. You know, it often does come back to the pivot, and sometimes it'll even break through the pivots. I've noticed sometimes price will break through the pivots and retest a bit here before only shooting up. So it responds differently. In this instance, you know, we'll go over these few examples and you'll start to get an idea. If we entered over here, we can also add in our daily pivots to look for even better entry or more precise entry. And you can see our first entry we could have taken would have been on this pivot right over here. As it breaks above that pivot, you can enter. That would be one position. And that would have been our entry. Otherwise, we would have waited for it to break another pivot. And you can see the next day, it broke above here. We might have taken that as well. But the thing to keep in mind, you always want your stop loss underneath the pivot. And I go underneath the pivot, and if there's a swing low, I go underneath that low. So if we're entering under here, it just means our stop loss has to be much bigger. See, if we entered over here, that would have been a 5% stop loss, as opposed to if we entered over here, it would have been a 3.8% stop loss. So the higher you go up, the higher your stop loss, unless you want to trade just off the daily grids, and then you can set your stop loss underneath the daily grid. But if you see in this instance, you would have been stopped out. But it's fine. You take a little loss, then you re-enter. So if we'd entered off the weekly grid, we would have been fine. If we entered off the daily grid, we would have been stopped out in that example. Then the next example, which would have been one of the best examples to enter, would have been on the third day of the week. Look how tight this pivot is, guys. Look how tight that is. As price gets on top of that pivot, this is a very high probability trade, because tight pivots let us know that a big trend is going to occur. When we get these very wide pivots like this, you can see price ranges. Look how it ranges around the pivot. And even over here, price ranged up, ranged down, ranged up. But now, all of a sudden, on the third day, we get this tight pivot. When it's so tight that it looks like one line, you know there's going to be a trending move happen. And look what happened. As price broke above the pivot, we got this trending move all the way up. So the way I like to do it, if it's a big space, if there's even if it's a thin pivot, it lets us know there's going to be a trend happening. But if there's a long distance from the pivot to the resistance, price doesn't often always make it all the way. So in this circumstance, what I like to do is I like to take a Fibonacci, draw it here, and I like to focus on targeting a 50, a 60, or a 70%, somewhere there, you know. Here's a 50, here's a 65. You know, you could have even taken a 65 as the golden pockets. And then this would have been your region somewhere over here where you would have looked to take profits. You wouldn't have waited for it, you know, like on other grids, and I'll show you examples of them, price will go all the way to the top. It'll shoot to the top because it's a small grid. But on grids like this that are very long, they have a lot of length, I would target a 50 or 60% of the high to take your profits. If we'd entered into this trade over here, it would have been quick and we shot into profits. If we wanted to re-enter, I would say just wait for price to come back to the grid. You know, and I mean, look, guys, this would have been a short opportunity here. You see it broke under the grid and then it dropped short. But I wouldn't have taken it because we're on such an uptrend. I like to just stick to one-sided bias. If my chart is showing me bullish, I like to only stick to bullishness. Otherwise, sometimes you can get confused, make mistakes. I mean, the chances, this was a fantastic short you could have taken. It broke under the grid, and then we had this nice drop. But it is a little bit more risky to do that. And then you'll see on the next day, price opened underneath the grid over here. And here becomes another entry. Can you see it comes close to the grid? Look at this rejection. And then we get another rejection into the grid. So it's also important to pay attention to these wicks and how they wick into the grid. This could have been the one entry when price came back to the grid, or this would have been your second entry over here. And then you see price went up. And let's see, how high did price get? So price has gotten 16% off this current grid, and it looks like another move is happening. Another entry would have been over here when price breaks outside of this grid. Can you see over here, price is stuck in the grid. and then it breaks out over here. That would have been another entry. And then you can see it goes up. Then look at the difference here. When this weekly grid opens, price opens underneath the grid, which is a little bit of a bearish sign, but then it quickly recovered and broke above it. So our entry into this grid would have been over here. As soon as price breaks above the weekly grid, this would have been our entry, and you can see it didn't take too long before price shot up 6%, and it hit our resistance areas. It bounced off of it. You can see these big rejection wicks into the resistance, and then it dropped back down into the grid. And now this could be another opportunity over here to see if price is going to go higher, because we've got these ascending weekly pivots and it's above the monthly pivot. It's looking very bullish. Okay, let's check out the next one, Coty. So this was another one that was called in the group on Monday. When I gave the signal, when I gave all of these signals, they were relatively close to the grids. Now you can see it's not the thinnest grid, but it doesn't have to be super thin. But what I did notice was that price is above the monthly, which is showing very bullish, and then price is above the weekly, which is showing more bullish. When I got to it, price was actually underneath this grid. When I saw the signal, price was, I think it was 7, 8, 9. It was around about here in my country. Actually, price was inside the grid when I sent the signal. So we don't know, but because we've got, I'm just going to turn this off to show you, because we've got these ascending pivots, you can see this weekly pivot is lower than this one. This one is higher, so we've got an ascending pivot. Because I saw an ascending pivot, immediately my bias was up. This is what gives us clues as to what direction it's going to go in. So even though it opened above the grid, broke below, when I saw it, it was in the grid. My confirmation was if it was going to break through the grid, we were going to go up because we were on this ascending pivot and because price was above this monthly grid, which is a strong sign that we're in a bullish market. So then how would we enter this trade? The first entry would have been over here as price broke above here, and you can see we got this massive liquidation, got this massive resistance. So I would have entered on this break. So that would have been your first entry. Otherwise, price comes up, then comes back down, and then we get another breakout over here. That would have been another entry. So we had two entries we could have entered into this grid. One entry, second entry. And then pay attention to this. I'm going to open these grids. So it's always important to look at the distance. You can see over here on this grid as well, we've got the same scenario as ENS. We've got a wide distance from this pivot all the way up to the resistance. So most of the time, price won't shoot up all the way. Look how it ranged in this area. So what we would have done, we would have taken, if we'd seen that, we would have taken our fib, drawn it from the top to the down, and we would have focused on this 50 or 60 area to take profits. But I mean, eventually it did go all the way up to the grid towards the end. So that would have been another entry. Now let's turn on the daily just to get more precision. These dailies are fantastic, guys. They really give you the best entries possible. And that's why I say, when the weekly grid opens, every day, just go to your chart, open the daily, and then trade according to the daily, because the daily is going to help you get more precise entries on this weekly grid. So we will see, we wouldn't have entered on this grid because look, it's super wide. These aren't the best grids to enter on, but this grid over here would have been an amazing entry for us. We wouldn't have entered on the 1 hour, we would have entered on the 5 minutes. So let me go back to the 5 minute to just show you how that entry would have been. See, look, as price broke through the grid over here, that would have been our entry right here. As soon as it's on top of the grid, and then look, price just shot up. And if you wanted to scalp, you would have just turned on the support and resistance and previous day high on that daily grid, and you can see. If you wanted to just do a quick scalp and be done for the day, I know a lot of traders that just day trade, you would have entered as price broke above, and you would have just taken profit as price hit this region. Because you're very aware of price being on top of the weekly and on top of the daily, so that would have been trade. You would have been done for the day That would have been a 6% win, risking 1.4%. Otherwise, we would have come to the next day, and you'll see the next day's grid is not as narrow. It's a little bit wider. So it can be a bit more of a ranging day. You can see this grid just shoots up. This is why, guys, understanding when you catch a narrow pivot, whether it's a monthly, a weekly, or daily, you know that there's going to be a big movement that's very high potential happening. It's not 100%, but it is a high probability that there's going to be a big move that will happen. But then look on this day. This is not the best pivot to trade, and you could have ignored it, but I'll show you why. Because look here, our first entry would have been when price breaks above the pivot. But when a pivot is so wide, it means price has got such a big space that it has to break through. Where on the other hand, when you've got a nice thin pivot, it's got so little space to break through. And that's the difference. When price gets caught in these pivots, you can see it just ranges and ranges. In these scenarios, it is recommended to rather open up Indicator X. Indicator X is designed for more range trading. I'm not going to get too much in that today. On Thursday, I'm going to give you guys a training on how to combine Indicator X with Trend X to show you how to know when's the best time to bring Indicator X out, when we're looking at these markets through the Trend X. So if you had entered over here, you see price just shot up and then broke down, and you would have been stopped out of this position. But also look, when there's a big grid, if we had entered over here, look how wide our stop loss would have had to be. So it ends up causing more risk if you've got a wider grid, and you would have been stopped out. But guys, also, it doesn't matter if you do get stopped out. This is part of the game. You're going to get stopped out. Sometimes you just set your stop. If you get taken out, it's fine. Because look here, we would have re-entered over here. Price broke above here. Okay, you might have entered on that, but otherwise you would have entered on this over here, and it would have been fine because you would have entered, stop loss would have been under the grid, and we would have targeted this region, and that still went in our direction. So this week over here, we had two very good trades we could have taken, and then we get the next day, and you can see over here, we have even a wider grid. On a day like this, you definitely don't want to trade with Trend X. This is more of an Indicator X trade because it's range trading, and you can see it ranges down, ranges up. So when you do see a wide grid like this, just know it is going to range. And when it's going to range, it's going to form a support and resistance area, as you can see over here. So it becomes very easy to find out where's the best place to enter at the bottom of this on the support area and take your profits on the resistance area. So wide grids, wide pivots show if it's going to range, so we know what kind of environment we're trading within. If it's a narrow pivot, we know it's going to trend, so we can understand what environments we're in. I love this tool, guys. Trend X is one of my favorite indicators. Honestly, it's amazing. It gives you such a deep insight into the market and how it moves. So you'll see over here, then we get this grid, which is a really nice grid, actually. This is a very nice grid to trade. It's nice and narrow. It's not too high. The resistance isn't too high from the actual pivot. But if you look at price, we might have got faked out over here and entered when price broke above the grid here. Because look, price opens inside the grid, and it's also very good to pay attention always, where does price open in relation to the grid? In this example, price opened in the middle of the grid. So we might have assumed when it broke out of the grid, we're going to enter for a long. If we did enter for a long here, we would have been stopped out. You see, so not every trade is going to be 100% of a winner, but it's minimal. With a grid like this, we're only risking 1%. So we would have taken our loss, and then we would have seen price broke under the grid. It came back, retested the grid, and then it dropped all the way down. So we would have waited for price to come closer to our weekly. And this all depends on how you're trading, guys. Like if you're going to be trading more of a little mini swing position, you're just going to enter close to the grid and you're going to leave your trade. And you'll see would have gone up and down, but inevitably it would have gone up and you would have taken profit. But if we're going to enter with these daily pivots, getting more precise entries, then we got to realize that there's going to be an up and down to it, because remember, it is a short-term trading. So you can see here, we've got ascending pivots. Can you see this one is higher and this one is higher, this one is higher. So those are 4 ascending pivots. And then all of a sudden, price is underneath the pivot over here. You can see price is underneath, and the next one, it starts underneath as well. Remember, if it starts underneath, the likeliness of it being bearish is much higher. But then also notice this. This is a very good place where you can look for a second entry. These 2 blue lines that you see here, these are the resistance areas. And the best entries are when price breaks out of them or back into them. Since in this example, we're only looking for longs because it's above the weekly pivot and above the monthly pivot. We could have looked for a long entry when price broke back into this pivot. These resistances. As price breaks back in, these also become entry areas as when they go out. So if we're on an uptrend, we're going to enter when price breaks just above these 2 resistances, or we're going to enter when price breaks these resistances here. You see we've got the 2 blue lines here and here. If price breaks out of them and we're on an uptrend in a bullish market, this is going to be one of our great entries. And the same thing over here. If it breaks in, this is going to be our great entry. So we could have entered over here or over here as a re-entry. And then we get the next day, and you can see price opens underneath the grid, which is a very strong sign it's going to be more bullish. We can also see that this grid is lower than this grid, which is showing that on the short term, it is a bearish downtrend. So we want to keep all of these factors in mind, especially if we're going to enter off a daily pivot on top of a weekly. But remember, guys, the environment we're in is bullish because we're entering on above a weekly grid and above a monthly grid. So we're in a bullish environment. We're just looking for more precise entries. In this example over here, you see price broke but didn't go anywhere, just dropped down. So this would have been our next entry over here. It breaks out, then as it breaks back in, that would have been our entry. These are reversal trades. Remember, price likes to reverse at the top of these blue lines, either upward or downward. If we're in an uptrend, we're looking for entries at these reversals at the bottom. If it's in a downtrend, it's a higher chance we're going to get a reversal at the top. And then our entry point becomes when price breaks in through these 2 blue lines. These are very important lines. If price breaks in through these lines, it's showing us that there's very good demand in the market because these were resistances. Price could not get past these resistances. So that would have been the first entry into this grid. Also notice it's quite it's not a super thin grid, but it's a medium thin grid. It's a very nice grid to actually trade. So then you'll see the second entry would have been when price broke above the grid over here. So the nice thing about Trenx X, it shows you guys, gives you so many opportunities to enter. Then over here, we get this next grid, which is not, I don't think it's such a nice grid because it's really wide. You can see it's a wide grid. And look at the difference in this grid. Can you see these are our 2 resistance areas? Look how wide they are. And look how little the space is from the top of the grid to the top of the resistances. We've got such a little space over here as opposed to this big space. So this is one of the reasons why I don't really like these kind of grids to trade. But even though saying that, look at the big movement we got out of it. So as price got on top of the grid, first of all, notice as the day opened, price opened above the grid, which is a very good sign. This grid is also slightly higher than the grid before it, so it's showing an ascending pivot. Then price breaks below it. As it breaks above, this would have been your entry if you did decide to take it. And then your second entry would have been when price broke out of these 2 resistant lines. So that would have been first entry over here, second entry over here. And then our target would have been At this point, we can even turn on the daily targets, which are our resistance 2, resistance 3 areas, if we just wanted to scalp. And we could have set our target 1 over here, but you can see because this grid is so wide, the targets aren't that high. So we might have wanted to go off of a weekly target, because the weekly target is actually what we were initially trading on. So we might have targeted the top of the range over here, but price didn't quite get all the way to the top. But let's see how much, let's just see how big was this movement. So Coty did 27% off of the grid. It's nice to just notice how price responds to these grids, the kind of movement it makes, because the more confident you can get in understanding how to use these pivots, the more confident you'll feel when entering them, the more you'll trust them. So I love to go through all the data of each grid, how to perform on that grid. And I like to review it. And I recommend for everyone, review your grids. Pick your few that you're going to trade. I don't recommend trading too many. I have a very good friend who's an extremely successful trader. He's actually in the group, and he trades pivots. He only trades one asset. He trades only gold, only one asset, and he makes money every single day. So sometimes it can be to your benefit to pick just a few assets and only trade those throughout the week instead of looking at too many tokens. The start of the week, pick a few good coins. I give you one's recommendations, and then you just trade those for the week. Every Monday, I'm going to add a list of narrow pivots, and then during the week, I'm going to review them. I'm going to talk about the dailies, and we'll focus on just going through those through the week. So let us check out another one, DYDX. This was also a very nice one, performed nicely. All of these are performing nicely. If you find a nice narrow pivot, they almost all of the time perform very nicely. So the reason I picked this pivot at the beginning of the week, guys, was same as all. We've got a narrow monthly and we've got an ascending pivot. So those are usually the criteria I'm looking for. I'm either looking for price to be above the monthly and above a weekly grid. And if we've got ascending grids on the weekly, it's showing us even stronger opportunity for getting long entries. And then when I got to this trade idea that I posted in the group, it was round about 4, 5. Yep, it was round about here. Price was basically on the grid. It was 11 o'clock. Yeah, it was about here. Price was inside the grid. So based on all the other criteria, I was just waiting for price to break through the grid. That was going to be the best entry, the first entry you're going to get over here. Also, let's turn on the other attributes. And let's look. So this is very nice. Can you see? Because there's not such a big distance from the pivot to the resistances, we could have actually targeted the resistance area. We would have entered on the grid and we could have targeted the resistance area, and that would have been our nice swing trade over. That was a 8% move, which is fantastic. That would have been trade number 1 done. Then if price had broken through here, this would have been the next best time to enter. When price breaks through, we would have entered over here and we would have possibly been stopped out. When you do enter on these, guys, this is called the R1 previous, because this is a previous week high and resistance 1. We call it previous week high, resistance 1 breakout. And I'm going to give a specific training just on these next week, because it's important to pay attention to the best areas to enter. Then it gives us this defined structure of when we're going to enter, when we're going to exit. But if we do exit at this point, we would enter over here and our stop loss would usually be under the swing low of the previous swing low. So this is quite a nice trade, because if there's not a big space between these two resistances, it means the stop loss won't be too high. In this instance, we would have targeted this level, but it didn't go there. as you can see, price came up only halfway. And sometimes we can also target the halfway mark, the 50% mark, because price generally hits the 50%. There you go. Pretty much like 90% of the time. So if we wanted more of a guaranteed trade, we would have just set to the 50% mark. I use my Fibonacci's to measure because it just gives you a nice idea, because guys, the market does not travel in straight lines. It oscillates up and down. And so many times you'll get into profit, then lose your profit, then get into profit and lose your profit. And sometimes it's good just to take profit and look for a re-entry. Take profit, look for a re-entry. Instead of holding on to that position and it kind of going like a seesaw, up and down, and it can affect you emotionally when this happens. It can really take a toll on you emotionally when you see your profits go up and then you lose your profits. So sometimes it's better just to take profits and wait for a better entry. If we'd entered over here, we would have either been stopped out if we were holding it, or if we decided to just take our profits at 3%. I mean, 3% is still a fantastic win. It's a fantastic win. And then you see price broke down again, came all the way down here, and then broke up again. But let us quickly add the daily pivots, and let's just see how we would have interacted with this trade with the daily. Because you can trade solely just on the weekly pivots, solely. But if you want more precision, I like to always check on the daily because it's just so nice, to see how much options we actually get. Okay, I'm just going to turn off these. So you can see this would have been our first entry if we entered off the daily pivot. We would have entered when price broke out of this pivot. It's a little bit of a wide pivot, but it's still okay. And then you can see the next day, price opens above the pivot, hits the pivot, breaks up. So we would have entered our second position over here. And our stop loss would have been underneath the pivot. So when we enter on pivots, we always put stop loss under the pivots. And then we could have targeted the weekly resistance over here. Just for a short scalp, it still would have been 3%, would have been fantastic. And you can see here would have been the next one to enter, but we're getting very close to the resistance. So I would rather wait to see, because when it gets close to resistance, it's either going to hit the resistance and reject, or it's going to break through the resistance and retest and then carry on higher. So it's always good to keep in mind that it's a if this, then that. If it hits there, there's a chance it can reject, or if it breaks through, retest, it's going to go higher. In this situation, you'll see this might have been another nice place to look, because price had just broken through the weekly resistance and the grid, the daily pivot. So this might have been a nice place to enter. And if we had entered just purely on the dynamics of the daily pivot, you'll see we would have entered over here and we could have taken profits at the top of the grid, which would have been a 2%, which is still a fantastic win, guys. 2%, 3%, it's amazing. So then price broke below here. Okay, so now we're on the new week. And you can see it's a little bit of a wider pivot, the weekly pivot. So that's why I didn't put it on for the future week. So let us review now. Dusk was also a great one. Oh wait, I want to see how high did DYDX get from the pivot. So this week, from the grid, it got 12%. So you can see, guys, the average coin is doing between 10 to 30%, so far off the grid. So let's look over here and see what is Dusk, how did Dusk perform for us. It did the same thing. Oh, it's so great. I love seeing this. So you can see similar scenario as before above the monthly. We got ascending pivot. This one is higher. This one is higher than that one. And then when I got to this trade, it was around about 11 o'clock my time over here. So price was inside the grid. But because of the other criteria, I knew if it was going to break through, it was going to be the perfect opportunity to long. And that would have been your first entry if you're entering purely off of this weekly pivot. And then also notice the distance between the pivot and the resistance is not that high. So this would have been a fantastic place for you to take profits. We would have entered just on that break. Stop loss would have been underneath this low, and our target would have been the top of the grid, either the first resistance line or the second line. That would have been trade number one. Trade number two would have been when price breaks through. Can you see it actually breaks through these resistances? And also notice the space between, you see those two blinds, they're very close together. When there isn't much space between them, price can usually break through very easy. So the chances of these trades, I mean, this was an amazing weekly pivot. It was like an A plus weekly pivot to trade. Then you can see another entry would have been over here. If we had entered over there, if we'd entered over here, as price broke above, stop loss would have been a little bit lower down. Like, you see, I don't like to keep the stop loss too close because these little wicks happen all the time. So like I would have given it room to breathe, and then you would have targeted either the top, and you'll notice it didn't actually get to the top. So in these scenarios, you can also just target the 50% because it always hits the 50%, or you could have targeted the 60%. So yeah, then what we would have done is we would have seen price, if we'd had taken our profit at the 50 or 60%, we would have just exited that trade. So it's good to keep in mind, guys, price doesn't always hit our take profit areas, which are these gray lines. It doesn't always hit it. You know, it can go up and then it can go. I mean, there's other ways you can see, you can draw trend lines, which is also a great way. It breaks the trend line, but then you're losing a lot of your profits. So sometimes it's better just to set a 50% target, and then when price hits the 50% mark over here, it still would have been 4%. It would have been fantastic. And then price is on a downtrend all the way back down to the grid. Let us turn on the daily pivots now and just see how would we have interacted with those daily pivots on top of the weekly. So here we go. So you can see this would have been an amazing entry. It's above the weekly pivot. It's also above the monthly pivot down here. And now it's above the daily pivot. So at this point right over here would have been our best entry. And you can set a stop loss under the daily or weekly. The weekly is always a safe place to set a stop loss because a weekly pivot acts as a strong resistance, stronger than a daily pivot. And a monthly pivot acts as a strong resistance, especially when it's tight. When you get a tight pivot, guys, it's a stronger resistance than when it's a wide pivot. That's why we're always looking for these nice tight pivots to trade. We would have entered over there, and we would have entered our targets at the top of the resistance because you can see this is such a nice grid. It's not too high from the pivot to the resistance. That would have been one area. If we'd missed that and we got late, we would have entered over here. You can see the next day starts. See the start of the next day with the daily pivot. Price is starting above the pivot. When price opens above a pivot, whether it's a weekly, monthly, or daily, it's giving us a strong sign that it's going to be a bullish market. When this happens, we could have decided to enter over here. Also, guys, look at the grid. This is a bit of a wider grid. So you do have a bit bigger of a stop loss, a bit more risky. But because we're basing this, the initial analysis of this trade is based on the weekly. And we're just using the daily as a guideline. So then we could have targeted at the top of this region as well. If this was just adding to our trade, if we'd entered over here and we just wanted to add to it, that would have been a good place. And then over here, we could have added again at this when it broke through. But then we would have made sure not to set our target all the way. I would say set your target at a 50% of the level, and you're going to guarantee to get a win. Then price comes down. You can see at this point, we get this daily is ascending to that one, ascending. Then over here, price opens underneath the pivot. Can you see? When you notice price underneath the daily pivot, this can show a reversal that's occurring on the short-term trend. Because remember, the daily pivots represent short-term. And then over here, the next day opens and it's in the pivot, then it breaks out of the pivot. So you can see we're in a short-term downtrend within a medium-term uptrend and a long-term uptrend. Because, like I said, you're going to get short-term downtrends within long-term and medium-term uptrends. Then price comes all the way down to the grid. When price came back down to this grid, this would have been the next best place to enter. I probably would have entered this trade over here, and you see we would have completely been taken out of this trade, because usually when it gets to a weekly, it can bounce off this level. But then also keep in mind, look at the daily. The daily price is opening under this daily, so it is showing that there is a short-term downtrend, and that short-term downtrend did break it underneath this grid. So then we would have waited for another entry, and this was our next entry. So all of a sudden, we get a nice thin daily pivot, which is showing us that there's going to be a trend going to happen. So you could have entered on this pivot over here, because remember, guys, we're still above the monthly, and this is the higher term trend. So we actually are in a high term trend. But then when price gets above the weekly, it just confirms it even more. If it gets above the daily, it confirms it even more. But I would have thought, as price broke below here, if I saw this, it's a strong chance if it stays above this daily grid, it's going to shoot to the weekly pivot. And you'll see it hit the pivots, then it rejected, and now the new month opened and it's a very wide grid. So we're not looking to trade this for this month. So let's review how high did it actually go for this asset. This one did very well, actually. If we'd entered close to the grid, we would have got a 16% move on dusk. It's very fantastic. KCTSI, this was also called in the group on Monday. Wow, this just shot off. Once again, look, guys, the same criteria. We've got the monthly pivots, nice and thin, and we've got an ascending weekly pivot. So this is showing us that we have a very bullish asset at the moment, and we want to look to trade when price is above the weekly. We can also see, if we want to add another confluence, we can see, look, we've got a trend line breaking over here. It's always nice to add price action confluences into the mix. So we would have entered this trade probably when price broke above the grid over there. That would have been entry number one. Or here you could have entered when price broke above the grid over there. Or over here, you can see these rejections into the grid, and we got this nice candle over here. We could have entered over there. So these would have been three different places you could have actually entered, and our stop loss would have been below the swing low, the lowest candle that's underneath the grid. And then look, this is a very nice pivot because it's not too much space. Okay, it's quite high, but not too high between the pivot and the resistance area. And look how tight these resistance areas are. Look how little they are. As when you see this kind of pivot, it's a very good pivot to trade, really. And then you'll see we could have targeted the top of the range, and that would have been 14%. That would have been an incredible trade, actually. The next entry would have been over here when price breaks through, but you can see it didn't quite hold. It broke through, didn't hold that region, and then it just ended up breaking down completely. And then just range trading coming all the way down. And then once again, we've got another trend line break. So trend line breaks, when you're above a weekly pivot or a monthly pivot, are also very effective, or even a daily pivot, because we know where the momentum's going. In this scenario, we know the momentum's going up. So we're just looking for an entry reason to confirm it. If we had turned on, let's have a quick look at the daily, just for more precise, and there you go. See, this would have been another entry point. So can you see, guys, adding these dailies really just helps gain more precision. We would have entered on that break, or we would have entered on this break, provided if we'd missed the entry over here, there's more entries, so we could have entered either over there or over there. And then you can see price shoots up, and then this next day, immediately price drops below the grid, and then kind of oscillates. So we wouldn't have entered. Remember, the further away it gets from this weekly, the more risk we have. So I like to enter close to the grid, either close to a daily grid or close to the weekly grid. But over here, say for instance, okay, if we had entered over here, because you always want to use the higher time frame targets because those are stronger resistances. So for instance, these two lines, because it's a weekly resistance, it's a stronger resistance than we would find, say we turned on the daily resistances. Can you see the daily resistances are here? But the weekly resistance is a much stronger resistance than the daily resistances. So it always takes priority. So if we had decided to enter over here, if we had decided to enter on this pivot, say we decide on the break of this pivot, price breaks above the pivot, we would have taken the target at the weekly resistance. We would have entered over here. Target would have been weekly resistance. Stop loss would have been underneath the pivot. So that would have just been a short little trade. So remember, it's so important to look at the bigger picture. We want to always trade according to the higher time frame, according to the bigger picture. And the nice thing about pivots, guys, which I absolutely love, is that no matter what time frame you're on, the pivots stay exactly the same. This is a price action indicator, a leading indicator. Most other indicators, if you go to another time frame, they change. Even indicator X, it changes on every time frame, but it's also a price action indicator. It's only working off of price, nothing else. The same as this. So even though we can be on a 1 hour or a 5 hour or 8 hour right now, it doesn't matter what time frame we're on, these pivots will stay in the exact same places. And then you can see over here, we get a very thin pivot, but you can see we get the rejection off of the top here. It hits the roof. These are the top of the ranges. So whenever you get these blue lines, the top of the range, and range high points, especially weekly ranges or monthly ranges, is a very high chance of reversal happening at those areas. So when it gets to this area, we can anticipate prices going to reverse. And you can see we get the rejection. And then we get the next day, we get the super thin pivot. Price breaks underneath it and rejects it. We even get a supply zone, breaks it, hits supply zone, and drops. And then once again, guys, you'll see this playing out over and over and over. We're above the weekly pivot, but then we got an uptrend with the daily pivots and then a downtrend with the daily pivots. So there's going to be a mini up and down trend within an uptrend. So let's see how much this point. We got 20% of CTSI. So guys, these would have been very profitable if you'd only just traded these picks I had in the group, or you just picked a few of your own, like 3 to 5 of them, and you just focused on those. It would have been extremely profitable for you for the week, even if you just focused on just one or just two. Okay, so XCN, this was an amazing one. When I saw this grid, I knew this was going to be fantastic because look how thin it is. So let's go through what are we noticing over here. First of all, this was the grid where I gave the signal in the group. Prices at this point, price is above the monthly and it's above the weekly grid, and it's an ascending pivot. So we know we're very bullish for this asset. Then we pay close attention. We can see, look how thin it is. Guys, when you get a pivot this thin, we know there's going to be a big trending move happening because it's so thin, it just looks like one line. That's it. So we know it's going to be a trending move that's going to actually happen. Then what we do is we know that our best entries, when I got to this, when I first saw this, it was 11 o'clock. So price, it had already made a move and it was under the pivot. So I got to it when it was under the pivot over there. And I was anticipating, because of this uptrend, that if it broke above the pivot, that was going to be the best entry to take. As you can see, we would have entered as price broke above this pivot. That would have been our first entry. But notice, guys, also notice on this example, look how much space there is between the pivot and the resistance. This is extremely high. In these areas, I wouldn't have targeted the top of the pivot. I would have targeted the 50 or 60% region. There you go. So we might have missed out because, okay, this did make a big move, but if we just targeted the 50%, 60%, 65%, it would have guaranteed we would have got a fantastic trade. I mean, that was, if we just targeted the 50% area, that was still almost 9% of a trade. That would have been fantastic. But then look over here, then price goes up here, it hits our target. See, if we had targeted a 50%, we would have taken profit and we would have actually been able to enter again. But sometimes people would just be holding the trade. They would have gone into profit, and then they would have come down, they would have lost all their profit, and then they would have gone into profit again. Can you see how doing this will actually ensure you make more money by taking less percentage? So here, say you target the 50%, which is what I recommend when we've got such a high range from the pivot to the resistance area. I'd say just be safe and target a 50% only when you've got this high range. Then what happened is we started getting a trend line that was being formed, which is fantastic actually. Price comes down, breaks below, and as it breaks above, this would have been our next entry over there. We had two entries over here. We could have entered as it broke above the grid, or we could have entered when price broke the trend line. And we would have done the same thing. We would have entered over here, and our target would have been 50%. Because we don't know at this point, we don't know how high it's going to go. We didn't know it was going to shoot all the way to the roof. And like I said before, whenever it hits a roof, that's when we generally get these rejections, because it's the top of the weekly range. Top of the weekly range is a very strong resistance area. And you can see it hits the range and then bounces off the range and starts coming all the way down. So that would have pretty much been, we could have caught two trades over here. Each one was 9%. If we'd gone all the way to the top, it did a 18%. But guys, we're never going to get it perfect. We're never going to time things 100% perfect. You know, trading is all about probabilities and risk management. And that's why we just go for these regions where we know that the likeliness is higher. You know, let's say there's 50% of this region. Let's turn on the daily pivots for a second and just see what it would have looked like if we'd used the daily as an extra confidence. And look at that. So this would have been very helpful. You can see if we waited for this, say we missed this trend line break, we could have entered on the daily grid over there. And then we could have even turned on the daily support and resistance for more micro targets. And you can see, look here, hit the grid, broke through here. This would have actually been another entry we could have taken on top of here, this grid. And then we would have targeted. So even though we're within a weekly pivot grid, we can start operating on our dailies. You know, we can enter according to the daily. We know that if price gets in the grid, it's going to be a nice long because we're above this thin, narrow weekly, which is showing bullish strength. And then our second entry is when price breaks above these two blue lines. That would have been our second entry. And then we could have just targeted, if we were just entering purely off of the daily pivot, we would have just taken our targets on these gray lines, or we would have measured our 50% of the range and taken that as well. So there's so many different ways we can actually trade. But I just wanted to, in this example, I just wanted to show you how we're using these weeklies and how we can combine the daily pivots to get more precise entries and just confirmations. So look over here and look where we are right now. This is actually, I didn't even notice this, but this could be another nice trading week, because this is an exceptionally nice pivot. So pay attention to this pivot. Definitely keep it on your radar as well. We're in an ascending pivot. All three of these yellows are higher than the next. Plus, look at the monthly is nice and tight. We're above it. So it's very bullish at the moment. This asset is very bullish, in very bullish territory. And as this new week opened, you could see as it got on the grid, it already did a 7% movement. So if price comes back down to the grid, that could be another entry. If it holds this grid, it could be fantastic. Or if price breaks above these two blue lines, that could be a very nice entry. If it breaks between here, we could get a nice 8 to 17%. So just keep this one on your radar. So let's have a look at the next one, CVX. Okay, let us look. There we go. Wow, this one performed fantastic as well. So you can see when the week opened up, this is where I gave the signal. It was around about 11 o'clock my time. Yeah, right here actually, right over there. So you can see we've got ascending pivots and prices above the monthly and the weekly pivots. So we're very bullish. At this point, you can see we've also got a trend line forming. So we can enter when price is on the pivot or when price breaks the trend line. Also notice there's not a high distance from the pivot to the resistance. So we can target the top of the range. That would have been our first target. And you can see price went there within 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 candles. Then our next entry would have been the break of previous week high and resistance 1, which is always our second best entry. Very high probability trading zone is this area here. And we would have taken our target at the next take profit area. And you can see this asset was just shooting. There was so much volume on this. Another place you can also enter is when you get the break of the resistance 2. See, so this is resistance 1. First gray line is resistance 2. Second gray line is resistance 3. So at the break of resistance 2 can also be another entry. And you can see we could have entered over here, stop loss under the swing low. And our target is the next. So price sometimes likes to travel in these blocks. It goes from block to block to block. Wow, this asset just kept shooting. Such a nice asset to trade. What did this do actually? From the weekly pivot last week, this performed 44%. See guys, these weekly pivots, they always perform. So far after all the ones you've analyzed, it's been 10%, 20%, 30%, and now 40%. So let us put on the daily now and have a look. If we traded with the daily, it would have been some fantastic entries. First best entry would have been close to the grid because this is such a tight pivot. And look here, we got a tight pivot the week before as well. Such a tight pivot, such a tight pivot. But if you look at this pivot, it's so tight, but we didn't get too much of a movement. But then this week, we got the full extent of the movement, just kicked in. So looking at our daily pivots right now, we can see prices above the grid over here. If we missed our entry on the weekly grid, we would have entered as price broke above this daily grid. This would have been our entry. Stop loss would have been under the grid or under the weekly grid if we wanted to be super safe. And then our target, we would target 50% of the weekly grid. Oh no, in this case we wouldn't, because it's the space between the pivot to the resistance isn't too high. So we would have targeted there for a nice 3%. If it had broken through, we would have added, because also you've got to pay attention to the candles. If you can see, guys, look here. These are very big momentum candles. Can you see? There's just green, green, okay, bullish, bullish, bullish candles all the way. There's no bearish candles. This is showing there's a lot of strength. And look, when it breaks the resistance, it just keeps shooting. So it's always important to notice, like, What are the candles looking like? How's the movement? It can give us insight into the momentum in the market just looking at the candles. This would have been our next entry. If we missed that, we could have entered on this pivot, this daily pivot, even though it's a bit of a wide pivot, so it's not the best pivot, but it still would have been a successful trade if we'd entered on the pivot. And then we can see this day it's a little bit tighter, so we could have entered on this pivot the next day or this day. Can you see how price opens above this pivot? This day it opened above the pivot. This day it opens almost above. This day it opens above. So on the daily pivots, we've got ascending pivots. Can you see one's higher, all higher than each other, all the way up to this point. And then price breaks, we get this tight pivot, price breaks above it, below it, and then eventually it breaks above it over here. We would have never known this was going to happen. And then we get this massive move. It's crazy, actually. We never know sometimes how price is going to behave. We can only read the data that's presented to us with the indicators to give us a stronger confidence areas and help us, make better trading decisions. So let's see. This was 44%. Okay, so let us look at the last one, CKB. This one was the winner of the week. It outperformed all our other coins in the watch list. So let us analyze how it happened. When I got to this token, it was underneath the grid, actually. It was underneath here. If you look in the trade areas, you can review when I sent them out with the positioning of them. And what I noticed was the same as what I noticed with all the others, my same criteria. It's above. Okay, well, let me turn this off just so it's easier to see. Price is above the monthly grid, and there's ascending weekly grids. Well, look here, we've got ascending monthly grids. So this grid is higher than this one for the monthly, and we've got the same scenario for the weekly. So we've got an ascending monthly and weekly grid, and then we get the nice tight grid this week. This is what really made me pay attention to this. Even though when I got it was under the grid, but my confirmation was if price breaks above the grid, it's going to be an excellent trade. At the same time, look here, we've got a nice trend line forming. So you'll notice it's so strange, not strange, but you'll notice the confluence of trend lines coincides with these nice and tight grids. You can see we've got a descending wedge over here. Price breaks the wedge, and as it breaks out the wedge, it also breaks above the weekly grid. So that would have been our entry over there. Okay, let us turn on the other attributes and just have a look at more details. So you can see over here, there's not a wide space between this pivot to the resistance. If we had entered over here, we could have set our target at the high, this resistance, and our stop loss would have been just underneath. And that was a 12% that just, look at the size of these candles. It took 1, 2, 3 candles and it just shot through. And then, guys, where we would have added to our position, as I always share, it's the break of previous week high and resistance 1 over here. And price breaks out at retest. So this would have been our next entry. And then because we know there's so much momentum in this trade, look at the candles. We know if we enter over here, we can set our target at resistance 2 or resistance 3. Up to you, but I would have probably set it over here because then it would have guaranteed. And then you can see it shot through. And then we could have entered again as price broke through this level. Remember, we're trading in blocks. From this block to this block, this block to this block. Trenx X just shows you these key levels that price likes to respect and move. And if price is shooting through these resistances with such explosive volume, it's giving us a sign that it's going to move to the next level. And we could have entered at this level to the next level. And then price even went further than that. This coin was unnaturally, it had unnatural power to it. It just kind of shot through. When a coin is moving this much, we can even just turn off the weekly and we can base it on the monthly. Because remember, guys, we can trade on the monthly, we can trade on the weekly. It all depends on how you like to look at the market. I'm just showing these weekly trades because they can give us, great movements during the week. But if we had looked at this just on the monthly, we could have actually chosen monthly targets. That's target 2, target 3. But this coin, it was crazy. Let's see how much it actually moved off of the grid. From the entry we gave, it did 200%. That's crazy. That's really crazy. Wow. Okay, let's have a look over. So let's add our dailies, because this would have been actually a great coin to trade on the daily as well, the daily pivots. So you can see, look how fantastic that would have been. Our first entry coincides over here. At this point, can you see price is underneath the grid over here, underneath here, and then it breaks above it over here for the first time. So at this point where price breaks above this daily, it's also above the weekly and it's above the monthly. So this would have been very great entry points. If we'd missed our entry purely on the weekly pivot. And then we could have added our resistance areas. So we would have taken our target right over here if we'd entered on that pivot. The next entry would have been if we had missed this previous week high and previous resistance 1 break, we could have entered on top of this. As you can see, as price opens, it opens above this daily pivot. Even though this is a little bit of a wide pivot, not the best pivot, we're operating off of the weekly pivot. See, so you've got to take all of this stuff into consideration. Look here, even though the weekly is tight, we know it's going to be a trending weekly, but then on the daily we get a wide grid. But this weekly overcomes the daily. So we've got to keep that in mind. Then we go a bit higher. This would have been another entry over here. Price comes, retest the daily pivot as it breaks above it. That could have been another entry right over here on this candle. And the same thing happens again. We get over here, this pivot opens. Price opens price opened above the pivot, quite high above the pivot over here, so we might not have entered on that pivot. But you can see price just loves to respect these pivots. It just bounces on them. So I'm often so amazed by how that works. All right, so this did a 200% move. And that is it, guys. That is the weekly trade ideas that I gave last week. So just showing you exactly how these weekly pivots can perform and just, learning how to enter them, where's the best times, and understanding, that sometimes you get these explosive movements from these pivots. Now I want to quickly go through the new pivots I gave for this week. So, it's one thing looking at the asset after it's moved. It's another thing looking at it before it's moved. So if we can see right now, these are the new ones I've picked for this week. I'm going to turn on, and you'll see my criteria is pretty much the same as always. Price is above the monthly pivot and the weekly pivot, and it's an ascending pivot. The weekly pivots are getting higher than each other. So you can see there's a good potential for trading this pivot this week. And it's a very nice setup, guys, very nice, because there's not a high distance from the pivot to the resistance, so this could easily blow through, as well as it's a very nice and tight pivot. Like, that is a very nice pivot. So this could be a very good entry coming up right now. Somewhere around here could be a good place. I've already entered this trade. I entered it, when did I post it in the group? I posted it, no wait, I haven't. Well, no, I haven't entered this one yet. I've entered a few of these, but this could be a great entry to start looking for this trade. Otherwise, every day this week, just turn on the daily pivots and just notice if there's entries, because this could be an excellent pivot to trade. If it breaks through here, you can even set alerts. This could be another great area to look for entries. Also, guys, there are alerts on the Trenx X, so you can right click and click alerts, and you can just click create and it'll just add all the alerts. The alerts will let you know when price gets to these resistance areas. So whenever price gets to this point, the alert will go off, because we know it's either going to resist that area, or if it breaks through that area, we know it's going to go much higher. So those are the two things that actually happen at this point. Either resists it or breaks through and goes to the next levels. But for now, we want to pay attention to this token. I think it's looking good for the week. The next one is USTC. It's already made a movement, you can see, but I think it's almost time. It's probably time to get another entry. If you're looking for an entry, it could be very, very soon. You can see it's also not too high from the pivot to the resistance, so we could trade it to the top of the resistance. It already did a 10% move, retraced back down, and as you can see, it's breaking a trend line now. And from all that, the pivots, when price breaks the trend line, let's see if we turn on the daily as well. So you can see tight daily as well. So this is a very strong likelihood that this is going to go to this level. So this could potentially be another 10, 17% move up to here. So pay attention to USTC, guys. Even if you only trade these coins, just as practice, you know, sometimes it's better to only have a fewer amount of coins. Okay, then we've got OGN, which is on the radar. I already gave this, it already moved quite high when I saw this, but all the other criteria really lined up. It's looking very nice pivots, nice and thin. It's above, see, look, in this instance, we've got a narrow monthly and a narrow weekly. So this has the potential to really make a nice big movement. And we're observing it's already done 4% above the pivot, but the chances are it can come down. If it doesn't come down, then every day we're just going to turn on the dailies and we're going to look to scalp trade on the dailies. You can see it's above a daily and a weekly now. It's looking really good. Okay, let's turn on all these other attributes. This is looking very nice, very, very nice. Also, because there's not so much space between the pivot and the resistance, if price, so we might have missed our entry, which is on the grid. This is the advantage of being awake when the weekly grids open up, because if you were, you would have seen that this would have been the prime entry. But your next best entry is just over here. If price breaks these two levels, remember you can right click, add alerts, and there you go. You'll be alerted when price breaks through there. So keep this on your radar. I also think it's going to perform. But also next week, Monday, we'll also review all of these and we'll look at how well they did perform. I think it's really important to start doing this, and I'm going to start creating it as a routine in the group. Every Monday, I'll add new pivot ideas, and then the next Monday, we'll go through them and we'll analyze them. So we've got APT as another one, and it's the same criteria, ascending weekly and above the monthly. So this is looking very bullish. If we'd gotten to it over here, it's already made a bit of a move off of the pivot. It's done around 4%, but it's also come down. So this could be another area to look to enter. Also, we can notice that the resistance is not too high from the pivot. So if we had to set a target, the likelihood of it reaching the top of this range is quite high. And once again, if it breaks through this resistance area over here, then we're going to look to enter so it can set alerts over there. So those would be the two entries that we're going to look for on APT. It's also looking good. It's got a nice tight weekly grid. And then we got Pith. Pith looked really good as well. When I looked at it this morning, it has now just broken through the grid. So let's see if it reclaims this grid. I really like the look of this, and I'll show you why. If you look at the previous week, look at the previous week's data. Can you see it's a very wide grid, and it just ranged. Then all of a sudden we got this tight grid. When you get a wide grid before and then you get a tight grid next, it's a stronger sign that there's going to be a very nice movement. And I've got a feeling this is going to make a very nice move. Also, we're above the monthly, and we got a very tight. I mean, that is as tight as it gets. Very narrow. So I would say a good place to enter is when price breaks above this grid. That'll be a very good place to enter. At the moment on Trenx X, there's no alerts on the grids, but you can just set an alert, a manual alert like this. I'm going to set one up right now as well, and then we can enter together. So if price breaks above this grid, I'll just bring it to the grid. If it breaks above that grid, I'm going to enter my trade, and you can see the distance is not that high from the pivot to the resistance area, so the likelihood of it reaching is quite high. It's 11%. So let us see how this will perform. Otherwise, if it gets to that region, if you miss it or don't take it, or it breaks through, you can add to your trade over here. I'll just set my alerts, and that will be the next place to enter this trade. But it's got great potential. I love the way this looks, and I feel like it's going to make a good move. But we never really know. We can also see it's hitting a demand zone. Can you see? Just above a demand zone over there. So we will review this next week, and we'll see how it performs. The next one is ETC, and it's doing a very similar thing as all the other ones. So I always look for the same scenarios: ascending weekly, above the monthly, and the weekly pivots. This is a very nice looking grid as well, guys. The potential of it breaking through there is very high based on how it looks. Very narrow grids. You know, our first entry would have already been over here. There already was a 2% move, but I feel like it's going to go and shoot through here quite easy. It looks like it will. You can see, look at the previous week's grid. Can you see just ranging? And look how tight this grid is compared to the previous week. It's almost like it's building up to something. Can you see it's just squeezing? When you get a tight grid, it's like it just wants to rocket off. So I feel like this could be a nice big movement. You know, our best entry would have been on the grid. We kind of missed that a little bit. So our next best entry would be over here. If you're willing to take a longer term swing trade on spot, you could probably enter right now even. But our most precise entries would be on the grid. Otherwise, let's turn on our daily and see what does the daily look like. So it's above the daily and the weekly already. So we can just set our alert here. So if price breaks there, we will be alerted. Now let's go to our next one. The next one was Ruin. And Ruin was also a very nice looking grid. Right now it's underneath the grid. So I want to see it break above the grid. You can see we got the same scenario I was talking about. The previous grid is so wide, and then we got this tight grid. Just notice the difference, guys. I want you to actually notice the difference, because we want to train our eyes to be able to see these things. This grid is so tight compared to this grid, which means it can rocket. So now I'm just waiting for price to get above the grid. I'll set an alert in the middle of the grid. So if it goes off, you can pay attention to that. Otherwise, the next entry is going to be above the resistance if it breaks this level. So I'll set an alert on that grid as well. And that's Ruin. Let's see, what's the next one is LTC. LTC looked great as well. See, guys, every week you just open your charts, you just find the tight grids, and you get these amazing setups. I do have a screener that's almost ready, guys. Like I can't wait to introduce it to you. I wonder if we can put it on for a second. Don't know why it's not loading, but it is almost complete. So I will show you the screener soon, but I'm also working on another screener. This is the one screen I'm going to introduce, but I'm working on even a bigger screener, which is going to basically scan the markets. It'll scan the whole of Bybit, whatever exchange, and then it will strip the data, and it will automatically give us these wide, or wide or narrow. Because guys, you can also trade the wide grids. Just means it's going to be a ranging market. But I'm working day and night. I've been working the whole weekend on these scanners. Once we get these scanners going, it's going to change the game because we're going to immediately be notified when we've got narrow weekly, narrow monthly, narrow daily grids, and we can just wait for these alerts. But that will be a future. I've got one screener coming up very soon. Wait, let's see. Let's see if it'll start for us now. I don't know why it's not starting. Okay, it's fine. So for this one, guys, LTC, as you can see, the same as I noticed, I let you know before, we got this wide grid, and now look how tight the grid is. This looks like a rocket that's about to take off. I've seen this happen so many times before. It just oscillates here, then it takes off. So I would pay close attention. This could even be an entry over here. Stop loss could be under these swing lows. It and target can be, I think if it breaks this, it could go all the way over here, because you can see it's not that high. It's a very low distance. When it's not a high distance, it means it can shoot through, and it's more likely to hit these gray target regions. But I think this is a high probability. We might even have a bigger stop loss under the next grid just to give it some room to breathe. But I think this could be a high probability trade. Otherwise, you can always set your alert over here. If it breaks this region, double click, set your alert so that we can be aware of what's happening with this asset. It's very good to track the coins that you're trading, and you just know what's going on within them. The next one was Solana. It also looked fantastic. This coin has been performing great, and it's one of those assets most people want to hold onto just because of the utilities, the fundamentals. It's really incredible token. But as you can see, we're on a thin monthly, and we've got, look how big this previous grid was, and then we've got a tight grid, thin grid, much thinner than that one. So this is one of the reasons this is on the radar. So we can either enter when it's on the grid, it's very close to the grid now, and it might even come down. And then the second entry will be over here at the break of the monthly high. Also notice it's quite close from the pivot grid to the resistance. So let's put an alert on here. So the chances of this breaking through here, it's very, if it does, this is another one of those tokens that looks like a rocket. And I can't wait to analyze this next week after it's occurred so we can see how it did perform. So keep Solana on your watch list. And then lastly, we've got Link. Link also looked very similar to the other ones I was showing you. Same criteria, above monthly, above weekly. Look how tight this grid is. I'm sure you guys are starting to see, because I know I'm getting so repetitive with this. We've got a wide grid, and then all of a sudden we've got this tight grid. So now could actually be an entry very close now. Price is going to break above the grid. It's definitely, if this does break above the grid, it's definitely going to go to this resistance level and probably shoot to the other resistance. Looks like another launch pad, so pay close attention. This could be a great entry coming up when price is above this grid. Otherwise, we can set alerts when price breaks above these resistance areas to add to our position or to enter at this resistance area. So always, guys, our first best entry is going to be on the grid. Our second entry is going to be above the resistance areas. So that is it for this training, guys. I hope you got tons of value and you're learning exactly how to master these pivot grids and Trenx X. So keep these coins on your watch list. I added them in the group as well if you want to go look and trade setups. And next Monday, we will review the success of these trades. If there's any questions that anyone might have, otherwise, I'm going to call it a day. If there's any questions, you can just put it in the chat, or you can unmute and ask me. Otherwise, if you've got no questions, that's all good. It's a good sign. All right, no questions. Okay, guys. Well, that is awesome. Thank you for joining this Easy Algo training. I will see you guys in the group. Happy trading and lots of success.